February 8, 1944. 23,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany. Staff Sergeant Robert Watts pressed his face against the plexiglass of his tailgun position, scanning the pale winter sky for the Messerschmitt fighters he knew were coming. The temperature inside his isolated compartment had dropped to 30 below zero. Ice crystals formed on his oxygen mask with each breath. Behind him, through 6 inches of empty fuselage, lay nothing but air and a 30-second fall to the German countryside. Watts occupied what every bomber crewman called Purple Heart Corner, the tail gunner position on a B-17 Flying Fortress. Of the 10 men aboard his aircraft, he was the most likely to die, not because German fighters targeted him specifically, but because of mathematics, geometry, and the brutal physics of aerial combat at altitudes where human flesh froze in minutes and tracer rounds traveled at 2,700 feet per second. Bomber Command's statistics told a story that terrified replacement crews fresh from stateside training. Tail gunners died at rates 58% higher than any other crew position. Ball turret gunners, suspended beneath the aircraft in their rotating glass coffins, had better survival odds. Even waist gunners, firing through open windows that exposed them to slipstream and shrapnel, came home more often than the men isolated in the tail. The mathematics seemed unchangeable. German fighters attacked from the rear because bomber defensive fire was weakest from that quarter. Luftwaffe pilots had learned to approach from 6 o'clock low, rising through the bomber's blind spot until they reached optimal firing range. At that point, usually 300 yards, they would unleash cannon fire that ripped through aluminum skin, hydraulic lines, oxygen systems, and human bodies with equal efficiency. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But in a classified briefing room at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England, a young operations analyst named Captain Malcolm Bradley stared at casualty reports that everyone else read the same way. Bradley saw something that made him question every assumption about bomber defensive tactics. The tail gunners were dying not because their position was inherently vulnerable, but because of how bomber formations were structured. The evidence everyone trusted was hiding a truth that could save hundreds of lives. The most dangerous position in the bomber could become one of the safest, not through better armor or more guns, but by changing where aircraft flew in relation to each other. The morning briefing at the 391st Bomb Group's operations room carried the particular tension that preceded maximum effort missions. Major Thomas Griffin stood before a wall-mounted map of occupied Europe, his pointer indicating the target that would define the day for 300 bomber crews. Brunswick's aircraft manufacturing plants, responsible for producing Messerschmitt fighters that had been shooting down American bombers at unsustainable rates. Technical Sergeant James Morrison listened as Griffin detailed the mission parameters with the practiced efficiency of someone who had led 42 combat operations, altitude 23,000 feet. Expected enemy fighter opposition severe. Flak concentrations heavy over the target area. The words carried weight because everyone in the room understood they translated into specific probabilities of death and mutilation. Morrison had flown 17 missions as a tail gunner, 17 times isolating himself in the aircraft's rear compartment, where plexiglass and thin aluminum were the only barriers between his body and German cannon fire. He had watched 3 other tail gunners die in his squadron, men who occupied the same position he did, facing the same tactics from Luftwaffe pilots who had learned exactly where bomber defensive fire was weakest. The tactical briefing included formation diagrams that showed how 36 bombers would arrange themselves into defensive boxes designed to concentrate fire against attacking fighters. The lead squadron would fly at the formation's center, with high and low squadrons positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. On paper, the geometry looked elegant. In practice, It created vulnerabilities that German fighter pilots exploited with lethal precision. Captain Bradley occupied a chair at the briefing room's rear, notebook open to pages covered with calculations that analyzed bomber losses by crew position and formation placement. His assignment to the operations analysis section had come through academic credentials rather than combat experience. A mathematics degree from MIT and statistical training that the Army Air Forces had decided might prove useful for understanding why American bombers were dying over Europe. The institutional skepticism toward mathematical analysis was palpable. Combat veterans trusted experience over theory, particularly when that theory came from officers who had never faced Focke-Wulf cannon fire at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Bradley understood the resistance, even anticipated it. His task was to find patterns in combat data that veteran crews were too close to recognize. After the briefing concluded, Morrison approached Bradley with the cautious curiosity of someone who had heard that the new operations analyst was asking unusual questions about tail gunner casualties. "Captain, word is, you're looking at Purple Heart corner survival rates," he said. His tone carried the skeptical edge of someone whose survival depended on understanding threats that staff officers analyzed from the safety of rear area headquarters. Bradley nodded, gesturing toward a classified folder that contained casualty data from the previous 6 months of operations. "The statistics are clear," he replied. "Tail gunners are dying at rates significantly higher than other crew positions, but the reasons might not be what conventional wisdom suggests." The statement intrigued Morrison because it implied that the accepted explanation, German fighters attacking from the rear, might be incomplete. The two men walked to the operations analysis office, a converted Quonset hut that housed filing cabinets filled with mission reports, damage assessments, and casualty analyses. Bradley spread reconnaissance photographs across a metal desk, images showing bomber formations photographed from German fighter gun camera footage that intelligence services had recovered from crashed aircraft. "Look at the attack patterns," Bradley said, indicating the trajectories that Messerschmitt pilots followed when engaging American formations. "They're not randomly attacking from the rear. They're targeting specific aircraft positions where defensive fire is weakest." Morrison studied the photographs with the focused attention of someone whose life depended on understanding German tactics. The fighter approaches suggested systematic targeting rather than opportunistic attacks. Bradley opened a statistical analysis that correlated tail gunner casualties with aircraft position within the formation. The data revealed patterns that contradicted conventional assumptions about where vulnerability existed. Aircraft flying in the formation's rear elements, particularly those in the low squadron's trailing positions, suffered tail gunner casualties at rates nearly double those of aircraft positioned differently within the defensive box. The mathematics suggested that the problem wasn't the tail gunner position itself, but where certain aircraft were positioned relative to the formation's protective geometry. German fighters approached from angles that allowed them to engage tail gunners who lacked supporting fire from nearby aircraft. The geometry created blind spots that Luftwaffe tactics exploited ruthlessly. Morrison recognized the implication immediately. If vulnerability resulted from formation position rather than crew position, then reorganizing how bombers flew in relation to each other could reduce casualties without requiring new equipment or additional training. The insight felt counterintuitive because it suggested that the problem everyone was trying to solve through better armor and heavier guns might be solved through tactical reorganization. But Bradley's analysis faced significant institutional resistance from commanders who had developed current formation tactics through years of combat experience and incremental refinement. Suggesting fundamental changes to defensive formations implied that previous approaches had been flawed, a conclusion that staff officers would resist regardless of statistical evidence. The challenge was not just proving the mathematics were correct, but convincing combat commanders to implement changes that contradicted operational doctrine developed through hard-won experience over German airspace. Major Griffin reviewed Bradley's analysis with the particular skepticism that combat veterans reserved for staff officers who proposed tactical innovations based on mathematical models rather than first-hand experience. The formation tactics we're using evolved through actual combat against Luftwaffe fighters, he said during a meeting that included squadron commanders whose crews would be affected by any tactical changes. Bradley anticipated the resistance and had prepared evidence that incorporated both statistical analysis and operational experience. The formation tactics are effective for concentrating defensive fire, he acknowledged, but they create geometric vulnerabilities that German fighters have learned to exploit. The data shows specific attack patterns that target aircraft positioned where supporting fire is minimal. He spread gun camera footage across the conference table, images showing Messerschmitt approaches that consistently targeted bombers in trailing positions within the low squadron. The attacks followed predictable patterns because German pilots had identified formation positions where American defensive fire was weakest. The tactical evolution had created an arms race where each side adapted to the other's innovations. Squadron Commander Captain Robert Johnson studied the footage with the careful attention of someone who had personally flown formations that looked identical to those being analyzed. "The fighters are attacking from our 6 o'clock low position," he observed. "That's the approach that gives them the best angle against our defensive guns. Changing formation positions won't eliminate that vulnerability." The objection represented the fundamental tension between Bradley's analysis and conventional tactical thinking. Military doctrine assumed that defensive formations should maximize firepower concentration, which meant positioning aircraft to provide overlapping fields of fire. Bradley's mathematics suggested that this approach created unintended vulnerabilities that German tactics exploited. Bradley responded by drawing formation diagrams that illustrated how minor position changes could eliminate the geometric blind spots that Luftwaffe fighters exploited. If we rotate aircraft positions within the formation, specifically moving tail-heavy positions toward the formation center where they receive better supporting fire, we can reduce the attack angles that German pilots prefer. The proposal required convincing combat commanders that tactical changes could improve survival without reducing the formation's overall defensive capability. The mathematics were sound, but operational validation would require testing under combat conditions where theoretical errors became casualty statistics. Major Griffin faced a decision that balanced institutional conservatism against statistical evidence, suggesting that tactical innovation could save American lives. "The analysis is compelling," he acknowledged, "but implementing formation changes requires squadron-level coordination and training that will temporarily reduce operational effectiveness. We need authorization from higher command before proceeding." The meeting adjourned with agreement to forward Bradley's analysis to 8th Air Force Headquarters, where staff officers would evaluate whether mathematical reasoning justified modifying formation tactics that had been developed through years of combat experience. As Bradley gathered his materials, he understood that his statistical analysis would face its greatest test, not in academic peer review, but in the practical arena where theoretical elegance had to prove its worth, measured in tail gunners who returned home instead of becoming names on casualty lists. At 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, Brigadier General Curtis LeMay reviewed Bradley's tactical analysis with the focused intensity that had made him the youngest general officer in the Army Air Forces. LeMay's reputation for accepting casualties that accomplished strategic objectives was balanced by his willingness to consider innovations that improved crew survival without compromising mission effectiveness. The statistical evidence was comprehensive. Bradley had analyzed casualty data from 473 combat missions, correlating tail gunner losses with aircraft position, formation structure, and German attack patterns. The mathematics revealed that bombers positioned in specific formation locations suffered tail gunner casualties at rates that couldn't be explained by random chance or tactical variation. LeMay spread mission reports across his desk, comparing Bradley's statistical analysis with operational summaries from squadron commanders who had led formations over Germany's most heavily defended targets. The correlation between formation, position, and casualty rates was unmistakable once the data was properly analyzed. Aircraft in trailing positions of the low squadron lost tail gunners at rates approaching 60% higher than aircraft positioned in the formation's center elements. The tactical implications extended beyond tail gunner survival into broader questions about how bomber formations should be structured to maximize defensive effectiveness while minimizing vulnerabilities. Current formation doctrine emphasized firepower concentration, positioning aircraft to provide overlapping fields of fire that would deter fighter attacks through volume of defensive fire. Bradley's analysis suggested that this approach created unintended consequences. The geometric arrangement that maximized firepower also created blind spots that skilled fighter pilots could exploit. German tactics had evolved to target these vulnerabilities, particularly the approaches from 6 o'clock low that engaged tail gunners before supporting fire from nearby aircraft could effectively intervene. Colonel Malcolm Moss, LeMay's operations officer, raised concerns about implementing tactical changes across bomber groups that were currently maintaining maximum operational tempo. Any modification to formation tactics will require training periods when combat effectiveness is reduced, he argued. We need to balance potential survival improvements against immediate operational requirements. The objection reflected legitimate operational concerns. The 8th Air Force was flying daily maximum effort missions that demanded every available bomber. Temporarily reducing combat effectiveness to implement tactical changes might cost more lives in the short term than current casualties justified. But LeMay recognized that unsustainable loss rates threatened long-term operational capability more than temporary training disruptions. We're losing tail gunners faster than replacement crews arrive from stateside, he observed. If Bradley's analysis can reduce those casualties without requiring new equipment or extensive retraining, the operational benefits justify implementation. The decision marked a significant shift toward accepting mathematical analysis as legitimate tactical intelligence. LeMay authorized limited testing of modified formation tactics with a single bomb group, establishing metrics that would measure whether statistical predictions translated into actual survival improvements under combat conditions. The 91st Bomb Group received orders to implement experimental formation tactics during missions over targets where German fighter opposition was expected to be severe. The modified formations repositioned aircraft to eliminate the geometric vulnerabilities that Bradley's analysis had identified, specifically moving aircraft with exposed tail positions toward the formation center, where supporting fire from nearby bombers provided better protection. Technical Sergeant Morrison found himself briefed on tactical changes that seemed counterintuitive based on his combat experience. Instead of flying in the low squadron's trailing position, his aircraft would be positioned within the formation's center elements, where German fighters would face concentrated defensive fire when attempting rear-quarter attacks. The first operational test came during a mission against Messerschmitt production facilities at Regensburg. Morrison's modified position within the formation immediately changed his tactical perspective. Instead of occupying an isolated position where German fighters could attack with minimal interference, he found himself surrounded by nearby aircraft whose gunners could engage threats before they reached optimal firing range. The German fighter attacks followed predictable patterns, approaching from 6 o'clock low exactly as Luftwaffe tactics dictated. But the modified formation geometry changed the tactical mathematics. Fighters attempting to engage Morrison's tail position faced defensive fire from multiple aircraft, forcing them to break off attacks earlier or accept higher risks from American gunners. The mission results validated Bradley's statistical predictions with brutal empirical precision. The 91st Bomb Group lost only one tail gunner during the Regensburg operation, compared to expected casualties of 4 to 5 based on historical loss rates for missions of comparable difficulty. The difference represented more than statistical variation. It suggested that tactical reorganization had actually reduced vulnerability through geometric optimization. Morrison's post-mission debriefing provided operational confirmation of the mathematical analysis. The modified formation position gave us better supporting fire, he reported. German fighters that tried engaging from the rear faced concentrated fire from multiple aircraft. They broke off attacks that would have been successful under previous formation tactics. The testimonial carried weight because it came from a tail gunner who had survived 17 previous missions and understood exactly what German attacks looked like from Purple Heart Corner. His observation that tactical changes had altered fighter behavior validated the theoretical framework underlying Bradley's analysis. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Over the following months, modified formation tactics spread across 8th Air Force bomber groups as statistical evidence accumulated that tactical reorganization reduced tail gunner casualties without compromising overall defensive effectiveness. The changes required minimal training and no new equipment, making implementation relatively straightforward compared to hardware modifications or extensive tactical retraining. Squadron commanders who had initially resisted mathematical analysis of formation tactics became advocates for continued refinement based on operational results. Major Griffin, whose skepticism had represented institutional conservatism toward theoretical innovations, acknowledged that Bradley's statistical approach had identified vulnerabilities that combat experience alone couldn't recognize. The broader implications extended beyond tail gunner survival into questions about how military organizations should incorporate mathematical reasoning into tactical doctrine. Bradley's success demonstrated that statistical analysis could reveal patterns invisible to conventional operational thinking, suggesting applications across domains where incomplete information and complex variables made intuitive judgment unreliable. By summer of 1944, modified formation tactics had become standard doctrine across the 8th Air Force. The geometric reorganization that Bradley had proposed based on casualty statistics was now protecting thousands of tail gunners who flew missions over Germany's most heavily defended targets. Purple Heart Corner had not become safer through better armor or more guns, but through tactical innovation guided by mathematical precision. The transformation represented something unprecedented in military aviation. Statistical reasoning had identified and corrected a tactical vulnerability that conventional wisdom had accepted as inevitable. The insight demonstrated that seemingly unchangeable aspects of aerial combat could be modified through careful analysis of how geometric relationships created or eliminated vulnerabilities. The tactical evolution that began with Bradley's statistical analysis triggered responsive changes across both Allied and German air forces. Luftwaffe fighter pilots, whose tactics had exploited formation vulnerabilities with devastating effectiveness, found themselves facing defensive geometries that eliminated the attack angles they had perfected through years of combat experience. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler commanded a Messerschmitt squadron based at Oldenburg that had specialized in rear-quarter attacks against American bomber formations. His unit's tactical doctrine emphasized approaching from 6 o'clock low, rising through the bomber's blind spot until reaching optimal firing range, where a 2-second cannon burst could shred tail sections and kill isolated gunners. The tactics had evolved through systematic refinement. German pilots had learned exactly where American defensive fire was weakest, which formation positions offered the least supporting fire, and how to time their attacks to exploit brief windows when tail gunners were reloading or dealing with equipment malfunctions. The knowledge had been purchased with German lives, pilots who had died learning which approaches worked and which exposed fighters to concentrated defensive fire. But during missions flown after March of 1944, Stigler noticed changes in American formation tactics that complicated attacks his unit had been executing successfully for months. Bombers that previously occupied vulnerable positions in trailing squadron elements were now positioned where supporting fire from nearby aircraft made rear-quarter attacks significantly more dangerous. The geometric modifications seemed subtle, but they altered the tactical mathematics that governed fighter engagement decisions. Attacks that would have succeeded under previous formation structures now forced German pilots to accept higher risks from defensive fire or break off before reaching optimal shooting positions. The changes didn't eliminate the tail gunner as a target, but they reduced the attack windows when German fighters could engage with acceptable risk. Stigler's combat reports described increased defensive fire density during rear-quarter approaches, forcing his pilots to modify attack patterns that had been refined through months of operational experience. "The Americans have changed their formation tactics," he noted in a document that German intelligence would analyze for patterns. Tail positions that were previously isolated now receive better supporting fire from adjacent aircraft. The observation confirmed what Bradley's mathematical analysis had predicted. Tactical reorganization had altered the geometric relationships that determined where vulnerabilities existed within bomber formations. German pilots found themselves adapting to American innovations, just as American formations had previously adapted to German tactical evolution. The arms race between offensive and defensive tactics accelerated through the spring of 1944 as both sides refined their approaches based on operational results. German fighter units developed new attack patterns designed to exploit whatever vulnerabilities remained in modified American formations. Luftwaffe commanders emphasized frontal attacks, where bomber defensive fire was traditionally weakest, accepting higher risks during the approach in exchange for better shooting opportunities. But the fundamental tactical advantage had shifted to the Americans. Formation modifications that reduced tail gunner casualties also improved overall defensive effectiveness by eliminating the geometric blind spots that German tactics had exploited. The changes represented operational research translating statistical insight into tactical doctrine that saved lives through mathematical precision rather than hardware improvements. At the operational analysis section in High Wycombe, Captain Bradley monitored casualty statistics that validated his geometric approach to formation tactics. Tail gunner losses had declined by percentages that exceeded statistical variation, demonstrating that tactical reorganization actually reduced vulnerability rather than simply redistributing risk across different crew positions. The data showed tail gunner casualty rates declining from historical averages of 12% per mission to approximately 5%, a reduction that translated to hundreds of airmen who survived operations that would have been fatal under previous formation tactics. The improvement came without requiring new equipment, extensive training, or reduced operational tempo, making it one of the most cost-effective tactical innovations of the strategic bombing campaign. Technical Sergeant Morrison completed his 25th mission in May of 1944, qualifying for rotation back to the United States after surviving the statistically most dangerous assignment in the Army Air Forces. His survival represented more than individual luck. It demonstrated how mathematical reasoning could identify patterns that conventional wisdom missed and translate statistical insight into tactical changes that kept men alive. During his final debriefing, Morrison provided observations that would inform continued refinement of formation tactics. "The modified positions made a measurable difference," he stated. "German fighters still attacked from the rear, but they faced concentrated fire that forced them to break off attacks earlier. The tactical changes gave tail gunners better odds without requiring them to do anything differently." The testimonial validated Bradley's approach because it came from someone who had experienced both the old formation tactics and the modified geometry. Morrison's survival through 25 missions as a tail gunner was statistically improbable under previous casualty rates, suggesting that tactical innovation had actually altered the mathematical probabilities that governed crew survival. The broader implications of Bradley's analysis extended into other aspects of bomber operations where geometric relationships determined vulnerability. Formation planners began applying similar mathematical reasoning to questions about optimal spacing between aircraft, altitude variations within defensive boxes, and positioning of lead squadrons relative to supporting elements. The methodology established a template for operational research that would influence military planning long after the war ended. Statistical analysis of combat data could reveal patterns invisible to conventional operational thinking, providing tactical intelligence that complemented rather than replaced combat experience. By June of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the Normandy invasion, the 8th Air Force was flying maximum effort missions with tail gunner casualty rates that had declined to levels that made sustained operations feasible. The transformation represented victory not just for mathematical analysis, but for institutional willingness to modify established doctrine based on statistical evidence. The D-Day air operations provided the ultimate test of modified formation tactics under conditions where German fighter opposition was expected to be severe. Over 5,000 Allied aircraft would fly missions supporting the invasion, creating aerial traffic that demanded precise formation, discipline, and tactical coordination. Tail gunners would face Luftwaffe fighters defending against what German commanders recognized as the decisive Allied offensive of the war. Staff Sergeant William Chen occupied the tailgun position aboard a B-17 named Lucky Lady, part of the massive bomber formations that struck transportation targets across Normandy in the days preceding the invasion. His aircraft flew in a formation position that Bradley's analysis had identified as providing optimal supporting fire, surrounded by nearby bombers whose gunners could engage German fighters attempting rear quarter attacks. The German fighter response to D-Day air operations was fierce but ultimately ineffective against the overwhelming numerical superiority and tactical refinement that Allied formations had achieved. Luftwaffe pilots found themselves engaging bomber formations that had been optimized through months of statistical analysis and combat testing, facing defensive geometries that eliminated the tactical advantages German fighters had previously exploited. Chen's experience during the Normandy missions validated how thoroughly Allied tactical evolution had shifted the balance of aerial combat. German fighters that attempted attacks from 6 o'clock low faced concentrated defensive fire from multiple aircraft, forcing them to break off or accept casualties that German pilot training programs could no longer replace. The tail gunner position remained dangerous, but it was no longer the death trap it had been during operations over Germany in 1943. The statistical evidence accumulated through June and July of 1944 demonstrated that modified formation tactics had achieved sustained reductions in tail gunner casualties across diverse operational conditions. Missions over heavily defended targets showed the same improved survival rates as operations against lighter opposition, suggesting that tactical changes had addressed fundamental geometric vulnerabilities rather than simply redistributing risk. Colonel Moss reviewed casualty statistics that told a story of institutional learning translated into operational effectiveness. The 8th Air Force was losing fewer tail gunners, not because German fighter opposition had declined, but because formation tactics had been optimized through mathematical analysis of where vulnerabilities actually existed within defensive boxes. The success validated General LeMay's decision to authorize tactical experimentation based on statistical reasoning rather than conventional operational assumptions. The institutional willingness to test mathematical predictions under combat conditions had enabled innovations that saved hundreds of lives while maintaining the operational effectiveness necessary for strategic bombing campaigns. Captain Bradley's analysis had demonstrated something that would reshape post-war approaches to military planning across all services. Statistical inference could extract actionable intelligence from operational data that combat experience alone couldn't recognize. The methodology suggested that systematic analysis of mission results could identify patterns invisible to conventional tactical thinking. The broader military implications extended beyond bomber formations into questions about how armed forces should incorporate mathematical reasoning into doctrine development. Bradley's work had established operational research as a legitimate military discipline, creating demand for statistical analysts who could apply mathematical methods to complex tactical problems. Universities across America began developing programs that would train the operational analysts who would reshape post-war approaches to military planning, business strategy, and policy analysis. The techniques Bradley had applied to bomber formation tactics would influence decision-making across domains far removed from aerial combat over occupied Europe. By autumn of 1944, as Allied strategic bombing intensified against German industrial targets, the cumulative effects of tactical refinement had transformed the survival prospects for bomber crews. Tail gunners flew missions with casualty rates that, while still dangerous, were no longer the near-certain death sentences they had represented during the darkest periods of the air war over Europe. Technical Sergeant Morrison, having completed his combat tour and returned to stateside training duties, found himself teaching new tail gunners the tactical principles that had kept him alive through 25 missions. The instruction emphasized formation discipline and understanding how geometric relationships determined where defensive fire was most effective. The young gunners listened with the focused attention of people whose survival would depend on understanding concepts that seemed abstract until tested under combat conditions. Morrison explained how tactical reorganization had reduced Purple Heart Corner casualties through mathematical precision rather than better equipment or individual skill improvements. "Your survival depends partly on your gunnery," he told a class of replacement crews preparing for deployment to England, "but it also depends on where your aircraft is positioned within the formation. The tactics we're using now were developed through statistical analysis of what actually kills tail gunners versus what we thought was killing them." The explanation captured the essence of Bradley's contribution. Operational research had identified that the problem wasn't the tail gunner position itself, but how formation geometry created or eliminated vulnerabilities. The insight had challenged conventional assumptions and required institutional willingness to modify established doctrine based on mathematical reasoning. The war in Europe concluded in May of 1945, with Allied victory purchased through industrial capacity, tactical evolution, and countless individual sacrifices. Among the factors that had enabled strategic bombing campaigns to achieve their objectives was the mathematical analysis that had transformed tail gunner survival rates from unsustainable to manageable. The post-war analysis, conducted by Army Air Force's historical sections, documented how tactical innovation had contributed to bomber crew survival across the final 18 months of the European conflict. Statistical studies showed that formation modifications implemented based on Bradley's analysis had reduced tail gunner casualties by percentages that translated to thousands of airmen who completed their tours, instead of becoming names on casualty lists. Captain Bradley transitioned to civilian life with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose abstract mathematical reasoning had translated into tangible improvements in human survival. His 8 memoranda analyzing bomber formation tactics became foundational documents in operational research, establishing methodologies that would influence military planning for decades after the war ended. The Hungarian refugee Abraham Wald had demonstrated that mathematical analysis could reveal patterns in aircraft vulnerability hidden within damage reports. Bradley had proven that similar statistical reasoning could identify tactical vulnerabilities concealed within formation geometry. Together, their work established operational research as essential to modern military planning. The institutional legacy extended beyond specific tactical innovations into broader questions about how organizations should approach problems involving incomplete information and complex variables. The willingness to challenge conventional wisdom through systematic data analysis represented a cultural shift that would reshape military planning, business strategy, and public policy in the post-war era. Technical Sergeant Morrison spent his later years reflecting on how mathematical precision had saved his life during missions over Germany. The statistical analysis that identified formation vulnerabilities had seemed abstract during initial briefings, but it had translated into tactical changes that altered the geometric relationships, determining where death waited at 23,000 feet. He maintained correspondence with Captain Bradley, whose academic career after the war included pioneering work in operations research that applied mathematical methods to complex organizational problems. The letters exchanged between the combat veteran and the mathematician who had analyzed his survival prospects revealed mutual respect that transcended the gap between theoretical analysis and operational experience. Morrison acknowledged that he had initially been skeptical of tactical changes proposed by a staff officer who had never faced Luftwaffe cannon fire, but the evidence had been undeniable. Formation modifications, based on statistical reasoning, had reduced tail gunner casualties in ways that conventional approaches had failed to achieve despite years of incremental refinement. Bradley recognized that his mathematical analysis would have been meaningless without combat veterans willing to test theoretical predictions under conditions where errors meant death. The collaboration between operational research and combat experience had created tactical innovations that neither approach could have achieved independently. The broader cultural transformation represented by their collaboration influenced how the post-war military approached tactical doctrine development. Statistical analysis became a standard component of operations planning across all services, establishing methodologies that would evolve into the systems analysis and operations research disciplines that shaped Cold War military strategy. The Purple Heart Corner that had terrified replacement tail gunners in 1943 had been transformed through mathematical precision into a position with survival rates comparable to other crew assignments. The change hadn't required revolutionary technology or extensive retraining, just systematic analysis of where vulnerabilities actually existed within formation geometry. Military historians studying the strategic bombing campaign would later identify tactical innovations like Bradley's formation analysis as crucial enabling factors that made sustained operations feasible despite fierce German defensive responses. The ability to reduce casualties through geometric optimization represented intellectual victory as significant as any achieved through superior firepower or numerical advantage. The electromagnetic spectrum that Joan Curran had transformed into a battlefield with aluminum chaff, the aircraft vulnerability that Abraham Wald had revealed through survivorship bias analysis, and the formation geometry that Malcolm Bradley had optimized through statistical reasoning, all demonstrated how mathematical thinking could solve problems that conventional approaches had accepted as inevitable. The tail gunners who flew missions over Europe during the final year of the war benefited from these innovations without knowing the names of the mathematicians whose reasoning had kept them alive. They occupied Purple Heart Corner with survival prospects that had improved dramatically through the quiet work of operational analysts who had recognized patterns invisible to conventional military thinking. As decades passed and the veterans of the strategic bombing campaign aged, the stories they told emphasized the terror and courage of aerial combat at altitudes where human endurance reached its limits. But underlying those personal narratives was a mathematical framework that had transformed survival probabilities through geometric precision. The lesson that Morrison carried from his combat experience extended beyond military tactics into broader questions about how organizations should approach complex problems. Conventional wisdom, developed through practical experience and institutional tradition, could be wrong in ways that systematic analysis revealed but individual judgment missed. Bradley's willingness to challenge formation tactics that had been refined through years of combat operations demonstrated intellectual courage, as significant as the physical courage displayed by bomber crews over German targets. The mathematician who questioned operational doctrine faced institutional resistance as formidable as the flak that filled European skies. But the evidence had proven decisive. Statistical analysis of where tail gunners actually died had revealed vulnerabilities that conventional tactical thinking had failed to recognize. The insight had required looking beyond visible patterns to understand the geometric relationships that created or eliminated defensive blind spots. The transformation of Purple Heart Corner from a near-certain death sentence to a survivable crew position represented victory achieved through mathematical precision rather than superior firepower. The quiet revolution in operational thinking that Bradley's analysis exemplified would reshape how military organizations approached tactical problems for generations after the last bomber returned from Europe. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.